Welcome to our class on the book of Daniel, taught for the British Bible School. This lesson was presented on Thursday evening, 11th March, in a Zoom class as the UK continues in lockdown, but as we're beginning to see some restrictions starting to lift. And so we're looking forward to life returning to normal. In this particular class, we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 6, a very, very familiar chapter to most. This is the outline that we're working towards for our study of Daniel, and we are in the 9th lesson, which is Daniel chapter 6. We're trying to take this in a chronological fashion and doing the best that we can with that. An outline for this chapter would look something like this. We've easily divided into two sections, the first 18 verses being the king's decree that everyone should pray to him, and then verses 19 through 28, Daniel being delivered from the lions. And we could subdivide those both into other sections. We could see that we've got the plan to entrap Daniel in his faithfulness. We've got Daniel caught praying, and then we see the angels shutting the lions' mouths, and then a new edict to worship Daniel's God. So the three sections we're going to sort of base our study in this lesson on are going to be the first two sections on the right, and then we'll finish up with the last section on the left, roughly about 10 verses, 9 verses each. As far as the timeline goes, the era of Babylon, the head of gold back from chapter 2 in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, was now over. The era of the Medes and Persians, the chest of arms and silver, had now begun. And we've started that, saw Babylon fall and Medes and Persians come in the end of chapter 5. We saw we were there in chapter 9 in our last lesson. And so this is where we are going to be in this lesson as well. Historically, this lasted from around 539 to about 333 BC, so far after the time of Daniel. Now, as we look at the text of chapter 6, well, the first thing we'll notice is there is no time given for the incidents recorded in this chapter. But it does seem to be early in Darius's governing of Babylon. So it would seem to be he's organizing his government. So I think we're fairly safe at putting it just right near where we had chapter 5, chapter 9, with chapter 6 coming just after that. Daniel would be in his 80s. He does, and he'd be at least that old. If it's placed slightly after that, he would be, of course, towards the 90 mark. As we open the chapter, again, we're introduced to who Darius was. As we've emphasized in our last few lessons, we don't know who this is. This is not Darius the Great. He comes a few years later. As we mentioned in our last two classes, we just simply don't know who he is. So here's some suggestions just to refresh our memory. John Whitcomb in his research came up with this being one of Cyrus's generals, who he made an extraordinary governor, whose name was Gubaru. And that very well could be accurate. But this man's never referred to in history as a king. Historically, he's never referred to as Darius except in the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures. And we know nothing about his father and nationality. So we can't compare that to what we know about this Darius in our text. We do know, though, that some governors use the title of king. We know this because of the Nabonidus Chronicles that have been found in Babylon. So it very well could be that this is Darius. Joyce Baldwin in the Tyndale New Testament commentary suggests that this was Cyrus under another name. And that very well could be as well. Although to me, the last verse in this chapter would make that highly unlikely. Although the NIV has a footnote in that last verse, indicates the possibility that this could be Cyrus and Darius could be the same person. So that's a possibility. A writer named Boatflower suggested that this was Cyrus's son Cambyses. My problem with this is that Cyrus really wasn't a Mede. He was a Persian, and this man, as we've already seen, is known as Darius the Mede. Also, we know Darius in chapter 5 was 62, I believe it said. He's in his 60s when he begins reigning there in Babylon. And Cambyses didn't live that long, so it doesn't seem to be Cambyses. Jack Lewis, who taught at the Harding Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee, suggested it's an unknown king that occurs between Belshazzar and Cyrus. This doesn't really fit history as we know it. Doesn't totally eliminate it because we don't know all of history either. But I don't think that's necessarily the case either. And then there's a chap named Rowley who said that this was the figment of someone's imagination. In other words, this is just fiction. Right now, I would go with John Whitcomb's suggestion as being the best. That this is one of Cyrus's generals. This is probably Gubaru under a different name. John Lennox comments on that in his commentary. He said, this idea is supported linguistically, by the fact that Daniel 9:1 says that Darius was made king, using a passive verb rather than an active became king. And B, by the fact that Daniel 6:1, that's chapter 5:31 in our texts in English, but the Hebrew Aramaic text is chapter 6, verse 1. But it says that Darius received the kingdom, which is an unusual way of describing a conqueror. It is also argued that Daniel never refers to Darius as king of Medo-Persia, only as ruler of Babylon. Perhaps a satisfactory resolution of this problem awaits the kind of archaeological discovery that was made in connection with Belshazzar. In light of that, it would surely be unwise to accuse Daniel of ignorance of the historical facts. I thought he had a good point there. Yes, we don't know precisely. It does make more sense right now that it's Gubaru, but who knows, we might find better evidence as to who this is as we uncover more archaeology. In the first couple of verses, we find Darius setting up his government. He decides to set up 120 satraps over the kingdom of Babylon. This is not Medo-Persian Empire, but the kingdom of Babylon. And over them, 3 supervisors. And again, depending on your translation, will depend on what it has there. Supervisors is what the Net Bible goes with. NIV has chief ministers, other translations, presidents, commissioners, administrators, governors. You get the impression very quickly we don't know how to translate that word. But whatever they are over the satraps. The Aramaic word, by the way, that's translated here is the word sarak, S-A-R-A-K. It's from a Persian word that means sar, which means head or chief or prince. So you can see how we've gotten all those different words as a translation of Sarak. It would seem that he divided Babylon into 120 provinces, with each being a supervisor over 40 provinces, and that seems to be fairly accurate. We do know that there were 127 provinces in the time of Xerxes, although only 20 to 29 under Darius I, according to historical records. A difference could be how they're using the word satrap. Some may be using it in a wider sense than others are. But anyway, we have here in the text 120 satraps. And there does seem to be 3 supervisors, so 1 supervisor over each of the 40. And Daniel is selected as one of these 3. He's a career foreign civil servant, isn't he? He would have been ideal in this position to be taken into the service of the new king. He's older. In fact, he's old, so he's got experience, and that would have made him a person that would be great to have in this particular position. By the way, notice as we get to the text that no longer do we find Belteshazzar used for Daniel. It's not the Babylonians anymore. It is the Medo-Persians. And so he's known now as Daniel. John Lennox again, says, Daniel appears to have come to Darius's attention very rapidly. No doubt the king was wise and shrewd enough to find out as soon as possible after the conquest of Babylon who the really able people had been in the preceding administration. The result was that Daniel soon found himself in one of the top 3 positions in the new kingdom, the triumvirate, to whom the 120 satraps were responsible. It was not long before Daniel distinguished himself to such an extent that Darius thought of promoting him even higher and giving him day-to-day control of the entire kingdom. So that's the plan. The satraps, so we got the satraps reporting to the chief ministers, and the whole idea here is to ensure that the king didn't suffer loss because of what the satraps were doing. So lots of checks and balances here. And Daniel became distinguished above the other 2 due to, the text tells us, the excellent spirit that is within him. He seems to have been a genuinely good guy. So the king plans to put Daniel over the entire kingdom. By the way, that would include over the 2 other supervisors as well. Now, the other 2 supervisors, and apparently the satraps, did not like this, but try as they might, they couldn't find any fault with Daniel's service for the kingdom. So they can't get rid of him that way. He's a very faithful servant of the king. Homer Haley wrote, the time is not designated, but it seems that envy and jealousy arose soon after Daniel's appointment over the joint presidents and the satraps residing in Babylon. Although other causes may be revealed later, it seems that these 2, envy and jealousy, sparked the immediate reaction and opposition to Daniel. So, how to get rid of Daniel when he's such a good servant? Well, they knew of his devotion to God. They concluded that the only way they could entrap him and to discredit him would have to be something to do with his religion. And as David Rechting commented in the Truth for Today commentaries, how wonderful it would be if the only fault in God's people were their faithfulness. I believe Peter wrote something similar to that in 1 Peter chapter 3, did he not? So, Darius, they come en masse to Darius. We don't know how many. It could have been all of them. It seems to be a good large number of them. They begin by praising Darius and then suggesting that the king establish an ordinance and enforce it as a law that anyone who made a petition to any god or man for the next 30 days, except to the king, would be thrown into the lion's den. And they told the king that all the officials were in agreement. Had all really agreed? Well, we know there's at least one that hasn't, don't we? So, could be possibly all but one. I think it's more likely that they only consulted those whom they knew would agree with them. The rest, who maybe they were even there, may not have known the reason behind this idea. But it's a way to get in good with the king, the new king, so why not? They may have thought. Homer Haley suggests that Darius may have looked at it this way. After the salutation to the king, according to the custom of that day, the plotters introduced their request with a lie intended to deceive when they said all the presidents, for Daniel was not present, were included. And unless the addition of deputies, counselors, and governors is covered by the word satrap, then these were falsely added to impress the king, which added weight to their request. Having consulted together seems to be false. For the members of the conference named above included only the 2 presidents and the satraps. That didn't get to the quote I was thinking I was going to have, but we'll get to it next when we see a little bit maybe of Darius's reasoning. But they want him to establish this according to the law of the Medes and Persians. And that's significant because that is a law that could not be changed or revoked. And it wasn't able to be revoked or changed because the king was honored as the representation of deity, the key mediator with a particular deity. Now, a deity, being a deity, obviously is unerring and cannot change. And so, therefore, any law made for him must be unerring and not be able to be changed. And that seems to have appealed to Darius, maybe to his vanity, because they were making him a god. And this is what Homer Hilly had to say. As the newly appointed king over the province, and with full confidence in his officials surrounding him, he saw this as an opportunity to become acquainted with religious views and concerns of his subjects. With this newly gained information gleaned over a 30-day period, he would be in a better position to give as their king. Remember, all life of that time was based upon religion. They were subject to their gods. So he thought, if they're directing all their petitions to him, he'll find out what's important to them, and therefore he can govern better. And he may have thought that way. So he signed the document. The injunction becomes law. John Goldingay points out that people like this do not really know what's in their own interests. Fancy stopping people praying when the prayer of the saints is designed to release God's peace and blessing in the world. Cyrus, in the Cyrus cylinder, we know him from what was recorded in end of 2 Chronicles, beginning of Ezra. He wants everybody to pray for him as he becomes the ruler of the empire. He wants all gods behind him. Well, Darius should have thought a little bit, shouldn't he? So, even though Daniel knows about the document, he knows that this is law, what did he do? Well, he continued to go to the window of his upper chamber, which faced in the direction of Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times each day as he had always done. The Net Bible Study Notes tells us that in later rabbinic thought, this verse was sometimes cited as a proof text for the notion that one should pray only in a house with windows, because after all, that's what Daniel did. I'm not sure that's good reasoning, but I thought that was an interesting concept. Now, Daniel wasn't trying to defy the king, but he wasn't going to go back on his habit of prayer to God. So God took precedence. John Goldingay, the Word Biblical Commentary, writes, thus Daniel's response to the prohibition on prayer is to continue praying. There's no fuss or rush about his stand, such as characterizes every action of his assailants, nor is he a man who has lost his true human freedom. He retains that while neither civil servants nor king behave as free men. He cannot hide that fact that he prays. When prayer is fashionable, it's time to pray in secret. But when prayer is under pressure, to pray in secret is to give the appearance of fearing the king more than God. And I thought that last bit there was particularly worth thinking about. That he faced Jerusalem goes back to King Solomon's request of the dedication of the temple. His request of God in his prayer that if Israel ever found themselves in exile due to their disobedience, they should repent and pray towards Jerusalem. We saw in our last lesson in Daniel chapter 9, which I think takes place just before this, that he has repented for the nation. He's acknowledged their sin. And we do see here that he prays towards Jerusalem. That text, by the way, in 1 Kings chapter 8, reads this way. When they return to you with all their heart and being in the land where they're held prisoner, and direct their prayers to you toward the land you gave to their ancestors, your chosen city, and the temple I built for your honor, then listen from your heavenly dwelling place to their prayers for help, and vindicate them. And as John Lennox comments, Daniel did as King Solomon suggested and prayed towards Jerusalem, a city we've not heard named since the beginning of the book. Daniel lived in Babylon and was faithful in the service of its rulers. But the secret of his integrity and faithfulness was that he did not live for Babylon. He lived for another city in the spirit of Abraham. and the patriarchs were looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Daniel lived for all that Jerusalem stood for. And that is very true, and I think a good lesson for us as well. We might wonder, why did Daniel pray 3 times a day? And if you search throughout the Old Testament scriptures, you'll find there's no command indicating that the people of Israel should do this. The normal was morning and evening. The sacrifices and the prayers that went on the temple were morning and evening. So as this was the normal, this seems to be something that Daniel had decided that he himself would do. May have been something that others did as well. Warren Wiersbe suggested that he prayed evening, morning, and noon based on Psalm 55:17, which mentions that particular way of doing it, praying 3 times a day. Kneeling, by the way, is also not the normal Israelite posture of prayer. They normally stood. The Aramaic is quite interesting as well here. Aramaic, literally translated, would be he was kneeling on his knees. As I thought of that, I got a bit tickled because I wondered, how can you kneel without being on your knees? John Lennox wrote, regular prayer to God, and notice not just once, but 3 times a day, was a non-negotiable part of the expression of his faith. He would continue to pray, law or no law. What a powerful and courageous act that kneeling was. Now, those who were plotting against Daniel, I think they pretty well knew that Daniel was going to do this. So they had arranged to come. I don't know if they came at morning, noon, or evening, but they knew when he prayed, they're going to be there to catch him in the very act. And they discover, yes, he is still praying to God. I don't think that they were surprised by that. Homer Haley wrote, for him to have ceased from his custom, or to pray in secret, or to have acted in any way other than what he did, would have been to manifest a heart of unbelief. So he followed his custom. His posture in prayer, kneeling upon his knees, indicated a spirit of humility and deep reverence towards God, emulated by Paul, Ephesians 3:14, and a worthy example for saints to follow. Caught red-handed. So what did they do? Well, we need to tell the king that there's somebody not obeying the injunction. It's interesting how they first questioned as to whether the king had really said this, had he really done this or not. I think they want to be the one to force them to tell of the one who had broken the law. So had he really said that? Yeah, who's doing it? So they get this opportunity to tell him. And after the king affirmed that, yes, he had made the law, they told him, well, there's this exile from Judah, Daniel by name. He doesn't acknowledge the authority of the king or his injunction because he continued to pray to his God 3 times each day. It may be that they had lookouts there and saw him all 3 times. Notice here that when they talk about Daniel, they only refer to him as one of the captives from Judah, not that he's not only one of the fellow supervisors, but the one that Darius wants to make the chief supervisor. I think that Darius figured out immediately that this was a ruse to get rid of Daniel. And the text tells us that he was upset. He was distressed. He tried to find a way to rescue Daniel for the rest of the day. Young's literal translation, the New King James Version, both translate this that he was greatly displeased at himself. That driver in the Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges commented that the at himself there is not really correct. It's not in the text. It's just that he's upset, just that he's displeased. And I'm sure that displeasure not only extended to those who had tricked him into making this law, but I'm sure he's a bit upset at himself as well. Darius tried to find a way to get Daniel out of the predicament that he had caused, but to no avail. Homer Haley writes that the king realized that he had been duped, deceived by his own officials, Though futile, he set his heart on delivering Daniel and spent the remainder of the day in an effort to rescue the man whom he respected. But the law of the Medes and Persians was against his effort, and that was the problem. In fact, the officials returned and reminded the king that he really had no choice. This was the law of the Medes and the Persians. This could not be changed, period. So the king gave in. He commanded that Daniel be brought and thrown into a den of lions. He told Daniel, your God, whom you continually serve, will rescue. That's the way it's translated there in the Net Bible. Other translations translate it maybe slightly differently. We find something like, may your God, whom you honor so consistently, may he deliver you. The verb that Darius used could just as easily be translated may. So the question for us, is it a statement of absolute faith that God would deliver him? Or is it a wistful hope that he would be delivered? By the way, the Septuagint here, the Greek translation, done a couple hundred years before the time of Jesus, added a little phrase. Your God whom you continually serve will rescue you. Courage till tomorrow. I don't think we find that in any Aramaic text, but nevertheless, they do find it in the Greek, which is interesting. I like that. Courage till tomorrow. So Daniel is placed in a den of lions, and a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. This lion's den was probably a pit or a cistern dug in the ground, or even a natural cave that had been reshaped for the purpose, with the opening to the den at the top. Idea being the lions can't get out. It's a good place to store them. Assyrians, Babylonians kept lions for hunting. If you go to the British Museum once it's reopened, you can see reliefs from these kingdoms. In fact, even cylinder seals showing lions and lions being killed and lions all sorts of ways. That were very popular. It was only the royalty, though, who could hunt the lions. That was reserved for the kings. Warren Wiersbe writes, or John Lennox wrote, using a lion's den as an execution chamber solved two problems at once: getting rid of tiresome opponents and keeping the palace lions well fed. Would do that, wouldn't it? But Wiersbe points out as well, the animals weren't fed often or great amounts of food so that their appetites would be keen in case there was to be an execution. Living at the gnawing edge of hunger didn't make them too tame. The king then, the text tells us, sealed the stone over the den with his own signet. So some sort of wax seal with his signet put on it, as well as the signets of his lords. The idea being nobody could tamper with this stone under the threat of death. Homer Haley wrote that this guaranteed that there would be no foul play by anyone. The king could not open the den and deliver Daniel, neither could the satraps kill him, and the other party not know it. So no way that anybody could tamper with Daniel that night. He's going to spend the night with a bunch of lions. That night, the king spent the night without food. Some translations have fasting here. It's not fasting in a religious sense. That's a different word. But it's fasting simply in the sense of not eating. I think we can see that he is worried a bit about Daniel to the point that he couldn't sleep and he wasn't even interested in eating. In fact, the Aramaic text there literally says his sleep fled from him. And he didn't send for any of his normal diversions to help him relax and go to sleep. David Recton wrote, Darius stayed awake all night worrying about Daniel. In contrast, Daniel may have actually slept while in the lion's den. So confident was he of his relationship to God. Whether or not Daniel expected God to deliver him did not alter his faith. His loyalty to God was uppermost in his mind. And at the break of day, just after the sun was up, so just after it's light enough to get there, to see what's happened, the king gets up and hurries to the den of lions. Apparently, the Aramaic word refers not just to he did it in haste, but also that he was agitated. As he came near, he cried out in anguish to Daniel to see if he were still alive. Had his God, the living God, been able to save him? Was his question, writes Homer Haley, an expression of doubt? Or did it express a desire for a positive confirmation of his faith expressed the night before? We don't know, do we? But he calls out, basically, are you there? Did your God rescue you? By the way, he refers to God as the living God. Suggests not merely that God was alive, but that he's also active, he's powerful, he's almighty, he's full of all. He's the one involved in bringing judgment and blessing. And to his great joy, he hears Daniel's voice. Daniel replied that God had sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they had not harmed him because he was blameless before God and the king. And the king was overjoyed. He immediately commanded that Daniel be brought out of the lion's den. And when he was brought out and examined, it was discovered that there was no injury on him at all, because he had trusted in God. Very similar to what we saw back in chapter 3 when they brought the three Israelites out of the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't even have the smell of smoke, but Daniel has no injury whatsoever either. So the king then commanded that those who had maliciously accused Daniel be thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The Aramaic is interesting here. Literally, it's those who had eaten the pieces of Daniel. The Aramaic expression is ironic in that the accusers who had figuratively eaten the pieces of Daniel are themselves literally devoured by the lions. Absolutely. In fact, the text tells us before they reached the bottom, the lions had overpowered them and broken all their bones in pieces. That tells us, by the way, that the lions really were hungry and did not spare Daniel due to a lack of an appetite or that they'd been sedated, but it's because God had shut their mouths. By the way, this idea of throwing others into a lion's den might seem harsh to us, but executing false accusers was a principle of many law codes of old, including the law of Moses. Those who falsely accused others were to receive the punishment they intended for the person they falsely accused. The execution, though, of an entire family, that's not found in God's law, but it was very typical of governments of this era and would eliminate, by the way, any who might later seek revenge. Get rid of the whole family and therefore you're a lot safer. Possibly, though, the only ones executed were just the two supervisors and their families. And that is a possibility. It's not necessary that all 120 satraps and their families were executed. Septuagint, by the way, that's what they have, that it was just the two families, the two supervisors and their families. John Lennox writes that the account deserves to be taken seriously as an analysis of power. For the situation Daniel describes is one of power politics. It starts with a group of conspirators using the law to have power over Daniel and simultaneously to deprive their king of the power to protect him. On the other hand, the power of God restrains the power of the lions to harm Daniel, but it does not do so in the case of the conspirators. Darius then wrote to all the people that he had a new decree. All the people should revere and fear the God of Daniel, because he was the living God, who had an everlasting kingdom and the power to deliver and rescue and to work signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And he had rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. I think in what he has to say here that we can see Daniel's influence on Darius being very evident. Homer Haley brings us, though, back to reality, I think. And he says, and though he honored Daniel's God as the living God, whose kingdom and dominion would be to the end, and decreed that the people would so honor him, he did not recognize him as the only God. To Darius, the living God was but a national God among all the national gods. And I think that's a good point to make. He doesn't become a follower of Yahweh. He's simply adding Yahweh to his list of gods whom he once worshipped. Daniel continued to prosper during the reigns of Darius and Cyrus. John Lennox tells us the story of Daniel in the lion's den has captivated children over the centuries. And rightly so. It is a thrilling story with a strong moral dimension, courage in the face of extreme danger, a remarkable deliverance from wild animals, and the ultimate vindication of a principled stand. Yet, it is no fantasy. And as we've seen, it's far from being only a story for children. It's an analysis of the nature of law, its use and abuse. And it would seem that we see a reference to this event in the book of Hebrews, in the great chapter that deals with people of faith. And there we find, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. Through faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, and there we have it, shut the mouths of lions. So Daniel would be included there with the prophets referenced by the writer to the Hebrews. What lessons can we learn from Daniel chapter 6? Let me list a few. I think, again, as we do in every chapter of Daniel, we see that God's in control. It's not humans that are in control, but it's God. We also see that God sees our faithfulness and that he's faithful to his promises. God is faithful, and he wants us to be faithful. And we should be faithful in all circumstances, despite what might happen to us. So often I think we think that circumstances dictate how faithful we are. Sir Daniel sure didn't believe that way, did he? Homer Haley wrote, "The time to learn to pray is now. Prayer provides and maintains a constant relationship and fellowship with God. When the evil day comes, the relationship is already established. Daniel did not allow opposition to his faith to hinder him in his prayer life." Yeah, he already had this habit of prayer. He was faithful. So despite the change in circumstances, he had his habit started and he continued that. I think we see in Daniel as well, definitely see in Daniel, we need to be willing to openly show our faith, despite what the consequences might be. What would we have done with such an edict? I think many of us, and maybe even myself included, might have continued my habit of praying, but I might have kept the windows closed rather than open, but not Daniel. John Lennox writes that this is a challenge to all of us. There is great pressure in the contemporary Western world for the privatization of the expression of religious belief, if not for its outright abolition. It is a widespread conviction that naturalism is the default belief system, and ironically, Christian theism has no place in the very academies that it founded in the first place. Daniel was prepared to swim against the flow. Are we? And I think that's a question we each need to consider. John Lennox went on to say, even though his loyalty to the emperor was established beyond question, Daniel was clearly prepared to swim against the tide of polytheism and assert his conviction that there was only one true God, the God of heaven whom he worshipped. He was not prepared to compromise that position, even if the emperor commanded it. that left him open to accusations of being arrogant, narrow-minded, bigoted, and antisocial. How could he possibly believe that he was right and the rest were wrong? Who did he think he was? It's all too familiar. That's a good point that he makes there. We're living in a very similar situation today. Another lesson I think we can learn is that sometimes the righteous will be disliked and hated. I think we see that particularly in Daniel's life. Homer Haley says, "We will have enemies when we stand strong in trust of God, for the world hates God and those who faithfully serve him. But from this chapter, learn that vengeance belongs to God, not man. Therefore, leave the recompense to him." That's a good point there too, isn't it? Yeah. We may have enemies, but that doesn't entitle us to do something back to them. John Lennox wrote, "What is it about Christianity that continues to stir up opposition? It is its claim to be unique. Jesus said, 'I am the truth.' And that claim enrages those who claim that there is no absolute truth. For them, it represents the height of unacceptable intolerance." And that is one of the problems, isn't it, that we face today? That because we serve an exclusive God, an exclusive Jesus, have an exclusive Savior, that means we can't accept any other way. And therefore, to people in the world, that is the height of intolerance. It's not to be accepted. We need to go with God instead. I think one thing we can see from Daniel is the need to plan to be faithful. See, this is not something that Daniel decided at the last minute. He decided when he heard the edict. His plan was already in place. David Recton wrote, "One has to determine in advance that he will be faithful to God regardless of the consequences. A prior determination makes the choice easier when the ultimate challenge comes." So I think that's so true. We need to have a plan in place. And our last of our lessons for this particular lesson, we need to be aware of anything which undermines truth and morality, whether it be a law or anything else, and especially something that's trying to promote self over truth and morality. John Lennox wrote, "Postmodern relativism has made deep inroads into many people's minds, resulting in an erosion of the concepts of truth, morality, and the value of human life. Put that together with the cult of self, and you're well on the way to engineering an egocentric society where truth and morality can be defined in such a way as to make sure it is I who survive." In fact, he writes a large section of his commentary, one of the chapters of his book, chapter 15, on the modern concept of tolerance. I think everyone would do well to read that chapter. That's in Against the Flow by John Lennox, chapter 15. Well worth our time to read. Yes, we face challenges today the same as Daniel did back in his day. And we can meet the challenge in the same way, being determined that we're going to follow God no matter what the circumstances, no matter what might happen to us. Thank you for tuning in to watch another one of our lessons on Daniel, and we'll pick up with the next lesson being from chapter 10, where we will start getting into the last vision of Daniel.